Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth episode now of the Analysts with Jake Novak. And of course, this is a very special episode because while we analyze the election, we have had a major wrench thrown into our election process with the conviction of Donald Trump this week in the so-called hush money trial. Now, I was a television news producer, executive producer for 30 years, and I can tell you that anytime an anchor or one of my writers put in a script the term unprecedented, or this has never happened before, I always looked at them and I said, you better not say unprecedented if you really don't know your history. You really better not say this is the first time this has happened, because usually I can come off the top of my head with 6 times in my memory when it's happened. This time, it really is unprecedented. We've never had a presidential candidate from a major party, from one of the 2 major parties, convicted of a crime during the general election process. This is absolutely uncharted territory. And so it's important for a show like The Analysts to explain to you what are the likely effects on the election, because you're hearing a lot of chatter, you're hearing a lot of noise from people who may or may not know what they're talking about, what's going on. And I'm going to give you my step-by-step predictions. And remember, I predicted a long time ago that there would be a conviction in this case. So I've got a pretty good track record here. I will give you my step-by-step predictions. But before I do that, I want to set up something in your minds that everyone needs to understand. One of the things that the political class and the news media, which is part of the political class, have done for many years in this country, I would say probably since the assassination of John F. Kennedy, is they've conflated. In other words, they've mixed up the difference between apathy and alienation. Voter apathy and voter alienation. I think voter alienation, the belief that no party or no candidate really speaks for you, the belief that the bureaucracy in Washington isn't doing the right thing, the belief that there's corruption from the top to bottom of government. I believe that that's been growing steadily in this country, probably since before the Kennedy assassination. If I had to pinpoint a time, I might say the Korean War. But let's just say since 1963 or the 1960s. And it's been growing ever since. And you can understand why the political class and the news media would have the bias to conflate that with apathy, to call it apathy, to think it was apathy. A lot of that is narcissism. Remember, to be a career politician or even career bureaucrat, you got to be a narcissist. And these people believe that if someone isn't voting for me, if someone isn't coming to vote, if someone isn't coming to rallies, if someone isn't giving me donations, it must be because they're just out of it. It must be because they just don't care. It doesn't even enter their mind that people might just think what I talked about when I described alienation. And this conviction of Donald Trump and the response we're going to get from it is absolutely going to be contingent on the difference between voters who are literally apathetic, the number of which I think is very small, and the number of voters who are alienated, which I think is a very large number. I think a lot of people are alienated. I think Donald Trump brought a lot of those alienated voters for decades back into politics, both for him and against him. There are a lot of people who wanted to really vote against him, and people who really wanted to vote for him who got back into the process. But you must understand that in that context. In other words, it's going to be what the alienated voters do. If you're really an apathetic voter, and again, I think that's a small number, then the conviction of Donald Trump isn't going to bring you back into the party if the COVID lockdowns didn't do it, if the George Floyd riots didn't do it, if so many of the other things that have happened, even in just the last 10 years, didn't do it. The conviction of Donald Trump won't do it either. It's not about apathy. It's going to be about alienated voters who feel suddenly compelled to vote one way or the other because of this conviction. And we'll have to see whether that means their minds were changed or they just felt like they needed to vote and they'll keep their mouths quiet. They'll just vote quietly. Those are the things I think people need to understand. That's the context. Now, what do I think is going to happen step by step? First of all, I think we need to take a look at the polls. Obviously, the polls are important. Of course, a lot of the polls are inaccurate. I've talked on the Analysts before about how national polls usually are much more accurate than statewide polls. That's counterintuitive. You would think that with the 330 million or so people in America, it'd be harder to poll that large number than a relatively smaller number in any given state. But that's just the thing. We have no such thing as national elections in America. Every election that we have is state by state at the biggest level. Otherwise, it's district by district or town by town. And states are hard to poll because whereas someone who's an American might move from state to state, my vote nationally doesn't change, but my vote from state to state would change. And it's hard to get those people's records accurately. It's hard to follow them accurately. It's one of the reasons why statewide polls are much more volatile. That being said, I think that once we get, now again, there's something else to come here. The other shoe to drop is the sentencing on July 11th. But I think that once we get to 3 weeks or so after the July 11th sentencing, I truly believe, and I've also said this all along, that this conviction will have no effect on the polls. In other words, it will have a short-term effect. But by the time we get to the end of July, I really think we're going to get back to where the polls were just before this conviction, which is to say Donald Trump having a small national lead, which means what you want to make it mean, because again, we don't have national elections. And he has a slight lead in a number of the key state polls, basic swing state polls, and just about all of them with one or two exceptions. I think that's where we're going to be at the end of July, and we should be very careful to ignore or at least wait out the statistical noise that's going to happen in the polls between now and then. Logistically, I think this will have a very big effect. Logistically, of course, we don't know what Donald Trump's movements are going to be. We don't know how he's going to be restricted in them, how the campaign trail looks. And again, this is something we talked about on the very first episode of The Analyst, and I've mentioned many times since. I really think that Donald Trump and all candidates should start going into the streets of the cities again and in towns and start talking to people. There's enough Secret Service protection to make this safe. People who say it isn't safe are just basically dodging the issue because they know their candidate can't do it and can't speak off the cuff. I think for somebody like Donald Trump, who does that very naturally, he should do that more often. But this may actually affect his ability to do so. There may be a number of cities and towns where he can't go. We'll have to see how that goes. Fundraising. Apparently a massive big rush to fundraising for Donald Trump on this conviction. So there may be a fundraising effect here that actually affects more than, that has a bigger effect than the polls. But remember, the Biden campaign and the Democrats have a big fundraising advantage already. This is not going to be overcome just by this conviction. So again, I don't know if that's going to really make a huge difference. Finally, though, and this is another thing I've been predicting all along, I think one of the big effects of this conviction is going to be those presidential debates that were agreed on, if you remember. Now, I said the moment that the Biden campaign agreed to the Trump debate, to debate Trump 3 times, that this was highly irregular. I was very suspicious of it for a number of reasons. First reason being, I don't think the Biden campaign wants Joe Biden on a live debate stage. No way, no how, as they said in The Wizard of Oz. I don't think they want that at all. But they also didn't want to pretend to be or make it look like they were dodging the debate. So they knew that this conviction was coming, folks, just like I did. I'm not the greatest genius in the world. I don't say how anyone looking at the judge, the jury, and some of the other parameters of this case wasn't predicting a conviction, and a quick one. I was right away. I know I wasn't alone, but I may have been the loudest voice saying this is going to be a conviction. Surely the White House knew there was going to be a conviction as well, or they knew it was a 99% chance. And so they agreed to these debates just in order to have the plausible deniability if anyone ever said, oh, you guys are denying or dodging debates. Because now they'll be able to say, how can we have that June 27th debate 2 weeks before his sentencing? That could influence the judge. That could be, we could be tampering with the legal system. We don't want to do that. And now they'll be able to say, we can't have these debates with a convicted felon or someone who's about to be sentenced or someone who was just sentenced. You get it. You understand. It was about setting up a very wise excuse. As far as I know, I'm the only one who saw this. I saw it on day one, and I think we can all expect the Biden campaign to pull out of these debates, or they'll find maybe even a way to get CNN to cancel the debate somehow and do it for them. But one way or the other, I do not expect to see Joe Biden and Donald Trump on a live debate stage at all. That, I think, is something we should look for. As far as I know, I'm the only one making a clear argument for this and have been for about a month. But that is what we should be looking for. Look, we have a great group of guests coming on to the program today, including our first guest is going to be coming up next. She's Mary Walter. You've heard her on Sirius Patriot Radio. You've heard her on Fox News Talk. She has her own podcast. She is truly a good political analyst. Of course, we're going to get her reaction to this election, the election effect of the Trump conviction. But we're also going to talk about some things that we think the GOP is doing wrong or missing out on in their campaign messaging. So you're not going to want to miss that. Stay with us. Mary Walter is next.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder, and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
All right, welcome back to the Analysts with Jake Novak. And as you just heard me say, we are going to be looking at what we consider to be the true election effects. We're not going through the legal case very much, because this is the Analyst. We analyze elections, we analyze campaigns and the messaging. We're going to look at how the Trump conviction, and it certainly will affect the campaign and the election. Now, you heard me say that I don't think that in the long term it's going to affect the polls. You heard me say that I think the fundraising, there'll be a little bit of a bump over time, and certainly a short-term big bump for Donald Trump, but I don't think it's going to close the gap between him and the Democrats. There's going to be some logistical stuff going on. There's going to be some places and some dates when Donald Trump isn't able to travel. That's important. But I also made the very big point that I think this will be used as the excuse that the Biden team knew all along it was going to use to cancel the debates that it agreed to with Donald Trump. Remember, it was very unusual. I don't think it's ever happened before that presidential debates have been agreed on between the nominees of their parties or presumptive nominees of the main parties before conventions. The fact that the Biden campaign rushed to make those deals before the end of this trial was the tip-off in my mind. I knew that they knew the conviction was coming, and I think that they made those deals just so they could say, we weren't trying to dodge Trump, but now we can't have a debate because it might influence his sentencing. He's a convicted felon who can't come to the location, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's see what Mary Walter has to say about all of this and more.
I have no stinking idea. I don't know what to believe anymore, right? Up is down, down is up. I don't know. The Daily Mail has a poll out today that they did after, the verdict was read yesterday. And it's a small study. I think it's like 500 people. And they asked them, are you more likely or less likely to vote for Trump now? 22% of the people who responded said they're more likely to vote for Trump now, while 17% said they're less likely to vote for Trump. As you know, we met on X, so we're all over there. And you see people like RFK Jr. You see people like Mike Pence, who can't stand Donald Trump, coming out and saying, this is wrong, and I support Donald Trump. So when it comes to the average electorate, though, I think a lot of it's already baked in the cake, like you said. A lot of it's already baked in. There are no never Trumpers who are now going to say, oh, you know what, this is really wrong, I'm going to vote for Trump. It's not going to happen. And I don't think there are any Trump supporters who are going to say, oh, forget it, he's a convicted felon, I'm not voting for him, Joe Biden gets my vote, or I'm just sitting out. I think it's a very small percentage. So to your point, I think it doesn't sway a lot. Now, all that being said, I think a lot of it depends on the sentencing. Up until yesterday, I didn't think they would throw him in jail, because Merchan could have put him in jail for all the violations of the gag order, and he didn't do it. So I was like, you know what? He doesn't want to go that far. His charge was to get Trump labeled a convicted felon. And it didn't matter how he didn't matter that he violated his first, his sixth, and one other of his rights. None of that matters, because they know it'll take a long time to go through the appeals process. And as long as they can label him a convicted felon before the election, that's all they care about. And that was Judge Merchan's job. That was it. So I don't know if he puts Trump in jail. I think they may be afraid to do that. Honestly, I think it would be hilarious, because he's got to go with his Secret Service detail, right? Trump would be in jail. They could make it a reality show, because he'd be in there buying people commissary, right? Like, he'd be in there. He would run that jail. It would be fantastic to watch. And honestly, I think that would make him more popular. I really do. People would see this as a step too far. I think people are already taking a step back and saying, I don't like this. I don't like Trump, but I don't like what just happened here. And you put him in jail, and I think that's a step too far for quite a few people. So I think, all of that being said, we have to wait and see what the sentence is, which, by the way, notice he keeps a gag order on Trump. Again, unconstitutional, but he keeps a gag order on him until the sentencing, which he pushed out as far as he could to a couple of days before the RNC convention.
Yeah, and I think that's another example of why I think they're going to cancel this debate. The Biden team
Yeah.
will say, "Well, he's under a gag order," and I mean, it was a setup all along. But I like your reasoning that we have to see how the polls and everything. We have to wait for the sentencing because I think you're right. People still don't really understand this conviction. They don't not, gonna-
Right.
but a sentencing everyone can understand. People can understand the difference between a fine and a prison sentence and house arrest. So I would have to agree with you there. I have to admit, I feel like I was cheating all along during this entire lawfare process because I experienced this and I watched it up close in Israel with Prime Minister Netanyahu. They did the same thing with him. They had a bunch of
Yeah.
trials against him. There were some convictions, and the effect on the polls was zero. It was still, I mean, it really made no effect. One way, it didn't really boost him, and it didn't really hurt him. It made no effect, and that's why I'm making that prediction. But the difference is, as you say, there was no real sentencing in the Netanyahu cases.
And if you don't mind, just quickly about your theory about the debates, because I think it's super interesting. I never thought of that aspect of it, but I also feel one of the reasons they did it early was because if they can't pump Biden with enough drugs to keep him going, that first of all, I don't think they thought that Trump would take it with all of the caveats that it's, that Biden gets to pick the playground, Biden gets to make the rules, Biden gets to pick the team players, the whole bit. I don't think they thought Trump was going to go for that. So when he did, I think they were probably surprised, but I don't know if they can keep, Joe pumped up with enough Joe juice to keep him going through the debate. And if he does miserably, that's their excuse to dump him off the ballot. Unfortunately, they have to virtually nominate him before their conference convention, because otherwise he won't get on the ballot in Ohio.
Right. Listen, I know I'm kind of an outlier on this. From day one, I've been saying that there's not going to be any replacements. No one's being replaced. But I know that there's a lot of great arguments saying, and one of my old arguments was, well, that would really be unprecedented. But we've already crossed the unprecedented threshold with this case, so it could happen. I'm still on record. I've been on record for over a year. They're not going to replace him, even though you and I and a lot of Democrats, by the way, would love to see him be replaced. But that's the way that goes. Mary, we started talking more independent individually again via X. And by the way, the term meeting on X means something very different now than it did 30 years ago. But that's another story. But we met on the legitimate X. And we started talking about how, again, this show is called The Analysts. We don't pull any punches. So I don't pretend not to be partisan. No guest has to pretend to be not partisan because there's no such thing. But it's so much more valuable when people from a particular side look at their side's campaign messaging and say this is good or this is bad and really are honest about it. And you and I want listen, we had a list of like 7 things, but I wanted to keep it to 3 things, and I wanted you to do the first one. We thought that Republicans were really fumbling and not taking advantage of some messaging. And you were the one who brought up this idea first, which is why I want you to do it. You thought that the Republicans were really missing an opportunity to speak out about Medicare and specifically Medicare Advantage. So why don't you explain to folks what you think the Republicans are doing wrong on that one?
Besides everything when it comes to messaging, or the lack thereof, they don't message. So I guess it's hard to criticize the messaging since they don't do it, and that's the problem. So Joe Biden just very quietly in April signed a change to Medicare Advantage that starting January 1st of 2025 will cost on average, the average Medicare Advantage participant another approximately almost $400 a year, about $397 a year. Very quietly did that. And the Republicans did nothing. They did nothing. You and I talked about it. You were on with me. I forget whose show you were on with me and they're not talking about it. I don't understand it. It's insane. It's right there. Democrats would have they would revive that commercial of the guy in the suit with the black glasses with grandma in a wheelchair, and he takes her to the edge to look at the view and then dumps her off. That they would have that going again. Republicans, nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing.
So I know, and it's amazing. And listen, I mean, it's all about having the kind of strong messaging. And I think the reason why it's so frustrating to me is it's a symptom of never understanding how to use heroes and villains. And I'm going to change that to the second issue that has been my issue for well over 20 years, which is when we talk about student loans, and now we've had this exacerbated by the Biden administration's forgiveness of student loans. And I understand. Listen, I used to write stand-up comedy. I get it. I know why it's funny to make fun of Starbucks baristas who have 3 PhDs. I get it. I understand that's funny. But politically, you should not ever go after the voters and some of these people who are in serious debt are not baristas at Starbucks with poetry majors. They were people who really were trying to better themselves. To me, it's unbelievable. These colleges and universities, who we found out the hard way, if you didn't already know, these last few months, are incredibly left-wing, incredibly anti-American, and have no Republicans to be found in their administrations. They're the ones who have been price gouging for 7 decades. We have all the evidence. They've been raising tuition by well over the rate of inflation for all that time because they can get away with it. The Republicans don't seem to understand that the American people will uniformly get behind them if they say this college is price gouging you. That's the one who's sending you the bill. People understand that. Not, hey, your kid is stupid. Listen, maybe your kid is stupid. I'm not saying they're not, but that's not a way to win votes. You want to win votes, you tell people here, the hero is the idea of education. That's the heroic thought. The villain is these colleges who are gouging you. And I still haven't seen, other than once in a while, Tom, Grassley, who's older than dirt. He's great. I love him, but he's not the man. He's not your messenger. I haven't heard any Republican really get this. And I think it's because political consultants are a bunch of young people who want to make fun of their classmates, and they don't understand the bigger picture. They're not parents like you and me.
That's a fantastic point. That is an excellent point. Why aren't they talking about this? College has changed so much. I went to Villanova. My niece went to Villanova, and when she went and when I went, 2 totally different schools. It's still small. It's still only 6,000 undergrads, 6,500 undergrad. That hasn't changed. The campus has gotten bigger. When I went there, the walls were cinder block in the dorms. You had bunk beds, or you could separate them. There was one TV in the lounge. All the women's rooms, because it used to be all male school, had urinals in the bathrooms. There was no gym for the students. Now they have gourmet food. They have suites where they can, they have their little sitting area. They have cooking facilities. It's insane. They have a gym for the students. They've upped their game. It's like a country club now. Well, my parents were not going to help me go to a country club. That wasn't going to happen, because you go there to learn. And we had the bare basics when I went there. You had what was there for food. I didn't even get on campus my freshman year. I never lived on campus because there wasn't enough housing. They were like, sorry, and go find a place to live. Good luck. And we're going to charge you to park your car here when you come. Yeah, it's so different now. And I blame that. But why did they do that? Because under the Obama administration, they decided to use federal funds to get these kids, because everybody deserves a college education, no matter their income. And they handed them out like Tic Tacs. And a lot of people got degrees. A lot of people went like 1 or 2 years of college and couldn't hack it and dropped out. Well, that's wasted money. A lot of them got degrees that they're never going to get a job in. That's wasted money. Some of them got degrees that don't really want to do that job. Wasted money. But when there's a bottomless pit of taxpayer money backing all of this, well, the colleges wanted to attract the larger pool of students now, right? So what did they do? They built beautiful gyms, and they have these gorgeous dorms. They have air conditioning now. We have air conditioning. They have air conditioning now. All of this stuff that, gourmet chefs and these menus and the food and the this and the that, because it's taxpayer money that's up for grabs. I don't blame the colleges. I truly don't. The government hung an incentive out there. They hung a carrot on a stick, and the colleges said, we're going for it. So I don't blame the colleges for price gouging. I blame the government for making this huge pot of unending money available to these schools.
Well, they're definitely the enablers of a kind of a crime, and I wouldn't deny that even for a second. So the third thing that has bothered me, and this is a little bit less of a criticism, because I think this takes a little bit more of a deeper thought, although I think this also would be a more winning message for the GOP. I think when California raised the minimum wage to $20 an hour for fast food workers, and very correctly and very economically, in an economically accurate way, people in the Republican Party and people like you and me pointed out that this was going to cost jobs. They were going to use kiosks. They were going to get rid of their delivery guys and go to Uber Eats or DoorDash, even though they don't make as much money out of it. And of course, the mom and pop or the mid-level fast food guys would suffer because they wouldn't be able to afford it. All those were good arguments. But I felt like the better argument was to make, the one that would really get more of America thinking and would get more and really make people think, and maybe I should vote Republican, or maybe I should do some of these other things that Republicans want, was the fact that people need to understand that the minimum wage is zero. No one has to hire your kid. No one has to hire anyone. And the fact that we have so many people who don't have any earning power isn't an indictment necessarily of the economy. It's an indictment of our public school system. We have millions and millions of public school graduates who don't have the earning power even to make any money per hour. $0 per hour is their minimum wage. And to make the businesses of this country eat their own profits, have to pay for the failure of the public school. It's one of those things where if I were a Republican candidate or a Republican political consultant, I would say, look, here's why we need school choice. Here's why we need the competition. We can't expect, remember, this was very at the forefront when Walmart was accused of, a very high percentage of Walmart employees are on food stamps. Isn't that terrible? Walmart should pay them more. No, we should be thanking Walmart, because if it weren't for them, they would need to have more food stamps. At least they're paying them something and taking a risk on people who have been given no skills by we have one of the most expensive public school systems in the world. There are only a couple countries that spend more per child than we do. And yet we still can't churn somebody out who can earn even $10 an hour. That's the real indictment. And I think that would be a better message than, the mom and pop stores are going to go out, which isn't a terrible message. It's just not something that everyone can relate to. Everyone can relate to the schools not being good.
Absolutely. See, the problem with this problem is that it's very complex. Notice it's many layers. It's very hard to make that a simple message. So I think the Republicans would do well to talk about, for school choice. Do you remember the video that the Democrats put out about this is Lisa and how she, or whatever the chick's name was, and she goes through her day? Remember that under Obama? Do something very simple. She went to college. She did the right thing. She went to college. She paid, $300,000 for her degree, and in economics, it's a great degree, but she's working at Starbucks or she's working at Walmart. Why is that? And talk about the different scenarios, show one kid who is trapped in a school by their zip code. I mean, that's a 1-minute commercial. This is the school this kid has to go to. Look at Ben Carson. Ben Carson, do something along those lines, very simple, living in their car with their mother, but their mother's making them study, because the parents are an integral part of this as well. School choice doesn't automatically solve the problem. It's a step, but it doesn't automatically solve the problem. So if you can educate parents, if the Republicans can educate parents and get the message out about the difference that school choice can make for them, that their kid doesn't have to go to the crappy rundown school just because of their zip code. They could go to a private academy. They could go here, they could go there, wherever their choices are. It would get parents excited, which I think you have to have parents get involved in schools, and it would make them more likely to push for school choice. There's a group of parents who are never going to want their kids out of public school, and that's fine. You can't educate them. You can't reach them. They're going to do their thing. They may not even be involved in their kids' life, right? They may not even, know what their kids are learning in school and don't care. The uninterested, detached parent, you can't solve. But 1-minute commercials educating the public on the difference that a school can make in your kid's life. They're not all the same. They're not cookie cutters. I think it's a super powerful message, and I think it's very, very easily done. And to your point, Republicans don't do it. It's a super complex problem on the surface, a lot of layers. But if you drill down into it, you can very easily get the message across in 1 minute. Do like 3 separate spots that are a minute long and even 30 seconds, and put them out there. I think it could be super effective.
Yeah. And I'm glad we wrapped up on this, because you touched on something that has been a big mantra of mine for a long time. I used to do local news in New York City, and the story that I thought was the best, that I enjoyed the most every year, but also hurt my feelings the most every year, was when we did the overnight. It was in January. I don't know if they've changed this, but overnight in January was the night when parents had to line up around the corner to get their kids into a charter school, and they were there all night.
Right.
And we would do that story. And whenever anyone, especially from the Republican Party, says like, well, the problem is the parents and you can't fix the parent. And I thought to myself, you might be right. Maybe 80% of the parents aren't going to do this for their kids. But first, we must service those 20% who are willing to make those sacrifices, who will take the school choice voucher, who will make their kids study. And when we help them, we'll have that many more people who will be an example of what this policy can do, and then we'll move on. We owe it to those parents to service them first. I know you want to go on TV and say their families are broken and they don't have parents who care about them, and maybe that's true of the majority. But we must service the people who are willing to go that extra mile. Mary Walter, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure everyone just go on her tell us your Twitter handle, so that your X handle, so that everyone can know when you're doing your shows. And also, it's just a really entertaining feed anyway, folks. You should always
well, thank you so much. It's Mary Walter Radio. There's no S, there's only one of me. So Mary Walter Radio on YouTube. Get her for my podcast, which, by the way, you will be joining me on my next podcast. And also on X and Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Mary Walter, you've been one of our best guests here on The Analysts. Make sure you follow her on Twitter. She's got the really good Twitter game, everybody, or X if you want to call it that. She's been great. And when we come back, we're going to talk about another issue that, again, I think a lot of those political consultants don't do it right. We're going to be talking to someone who's going to tell us about whether or not the Latino vote, whether the so-called shift of Latinos to the GOP is real or is it fool's gold. Only going to hear this on The Analysts. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
What does it mean to be a leader?
It's taking my first solo flight.
At the University of North Dakota, we lead our own way.
Hi, welcome back to The Analyst with Jake Novak. I'm Jake Novak, and we're about to discuss something that you're really not going to hear anywhere else. The reality of this talk about Latinos voting more for Republicans in recent elections and whether that's going to continue in 2024. We're going to talk to someone who really crunched those numbers and has some realities to share with us that you're not going to hear anywhere else, like I said. But just to reiterate our top story, and of course the elephant in the room all week when you talk about this election, is what will the effect of the Donald Trump conviction be on this election? Now, you've heard me say a couple of times, both on this episode and others, that I don't think it's going to have a long-term effect on the polls. I think we'll see some jumps one way or the other, but once we get 3 or 4 weeks past the sentencing, I think we'll go right back to where we are right now. My biggest prediction, again, one that I made as soon as the debate agreements were made, is that they knew the conviction was coming, the Biden team did, and they were ready to agree to these debates, when really what they were preparing to do is to use the conviction as an excuse to bow out of them and to have plausible deniability if anyone ever accuses them of trying to dodge the debates. But forget about me. Let's get Eduardo Neret, our next guest. He is a political analyst, and he has written an amazing article about the Latino vote and the GOP. But first, let's get Eduardo's take on what he thinks about the conviction, the polls, and my idea about the debates.
Well, Jake, thanks for having me. I think the debate thing's interesting. I hadn't really thought of that, but it makes sense. Look, Biden gets the credit of, at least to the public, of saying, look, I wanted to debate him. I was willing to debate him, and I agreed to the debate, and he agreed to my terms. But then he can quietly back out. So I hadn't quite thought of that. As to my reaction to the whole thing, can I curse here? Or can I curse in this podcast? I mean, I think yesterday's, and people don't need to hear it from me. I mean, I think people have arrived at these conclusions on their own. But what happened yesterday was complete BS. It's an effing disgrace, really, to the country. And it says a lot about where we are. And I don't know, I never would have thought in my lifetime that the front runner in a presidential election would be arrested on some Mickey Mouse crime, if you can even call it that. I mean, I'm not even sure there's a crime. They didn't even really have to identify what the crime was ahead of an election like this, but that's where we are. And I think moving beyond the reaction, because I think people can tune into their cable news channels to see what the reaction is going to be politically, how it's going to affect the polls and all that stuff. But I've spent a lot of time thinking about the Republican Party and how the Republican Party has reacted. I think, at least for me personally, yesterday wasn't a surprise. One thing is obviously to see it on TV, but after they raided Mar-a-Lago, after they arrested Trump, after they charged him, the Republican movement as a political movement, as a grassroots movement, they've had a lot of time to plan how they were going to react to this. And so I woke up today hoping to see these grassroots organizations, these 501c3s in Washington, D.C., these think tanks that are all part of Conservative Inc. that raise tens of millions of dollars in donor money a year. I was hoping they were going to come out today and call for a march on Washington, call for a march in New York, do something with all the money that they raise every single year. And I haven't seen that yet. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. I mean, what are the point of these organizations if they're going to raise this type of donor money and when their candidate, the front runner, gets arrested right before an election, they can't be found? I mean, what good is your activism if you're not willing to do something now? If it were the left, they'd be out on the streets. We saw them do that in 2020. They were willing to burn cities to the ground if it meant obtaining power, and they did that. And, you know, I don't want that. Nobody wants violence. But how can you play fairly when one side is willing to go to those extremes and all you're willing to do is put out a strongly worded statement or put out a tweet on X about how terrible this is? So I don't know what the answer is for conservatives as a movement. I think we should go out and vote. If you feel compelled to donate, you should do that. But I have some questions for the Republican political class in Washington. What are they doing? They need to come out and answer for their voters. Really quickly on the polls, because you asked me about that. You know, Fox News was saying yesterday, oh, you know, this is going to bring people out to support Trump and everything like that. I'm not so sure. I mean, I think you've got a percentage of people who already support him who are going to be driven even more to support him. But there are also some polls showing that, you know, upwards of 15, 20, 30% of independent-minded voters who wouldn't vote for a convict. And as dumb as that sounds, look, that's the average American voter. The average American voter doesn't have the bandwidth to follow the intricacies of this trial, and they're going to be inundated with the left-wing propaganda that is essentially on every cable news channel. And when that's the reality, we live in our media and political ecosystem, you know, I'm not sure what this does for the polls. I think we'll have to wait and see. But it's not a shoo-in. I mean, I think especially if they're able to get Trump off the campaign trail, if they're able to actually sentence him to jail, they didn't just do this for the optics. They fully intend on winning this November. And one more thing too. I mean, if they were willing to go this far to charge him, I mean, are they really going to let the election go? Do we really think the Democrats are just going to let Trump win, even if he does? So a lot of questions, and I think we'll be having a really interesting summer and seeing how all this plays out.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like we're pretty much mostly on the same page based on what you're talking about. At the top of the show, I talked about conflating alienation with apathy, but I want to throw in a third factor, which is fear. I mean, one of the things I really felt last night, and I've been predicting a conviction in this trial since the day the judge was assigned, and especially after the jury questionnaire information came out. I've been reminding people week after week, it's going to be a conviction. Stop fooling yourself. So I too wasn't surprised. But I have to say, I woke up this morning really with a bigger sense of fear than I've ever had. I mean, the idea that the courts are this corrupted, and we've had corrupted courts in America before. It's not like this is the first time. Certainly the courts in the South during segregation were corrupt. More recently, everyone knows the story of that judge who was sentencing every juvenile he saw in front of his court to the detention centers because he was getting paid a kickback for every kid that he sent there. I mean, that's really bad, right? I mean, we know some of these things happen, but this is so coordinated politically. This isn't just like, well, one judge who's just being, aw shucks, I'm going to enforce a Jim Crow law, and that's terrible. I'm not belittling that, but it didn't really take a national conspiracy. And that judge in, I guess it was Pennsylvania, who was sentencing the kids to detention centers, also terrible, ruined lives. I understand that, but that wasn't a national conspiracy. That was the old school bribery in the back, in the back door of a car. This is a national conspiracy. There's really no other way to say it, and it's scary. It's really, really scary. Having courts of justice, not perfect courts, not ones that always do it right, but having courts that are at least trying to be just, are one of the 7 pillars of society and the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's called the 7 Noahide laws. And it's really, really important. Again, no one's expecting perfection, just the idea that you're going to try here. We're going to make a shot at it, and that's been thrown away, and that's really, really scary. But I think fear plays a big, big role in elections. And if people are afraid, then what they'll do is they won't speak up, like you said, Eduardo. They may not march across the country, but they may go and vote very, very, quietly. They may not talk about it, and they may be more likely to go and do that. But we'll never know that. They certainly aren't going to talk to a pollster. I did polling back in the 90s, and I can tell you the key factor is, does the person I want to call who's most representative of the electorate, they're going to answer the phone? And when they don't, I have to throw that whole demographic out and try again. And when big news stories like this happen, usually people answer the phone more often. That's why you see this move in the poll. You get the better sample size. But I think this is going to be different. I think there's going to be people who won't want to answer the phone, especially if they're voting for Trump. So I think we're mostly on the same page. But speaking of voting and demographics, you had an amazing article that you put out on Substack this week about what you call the myth of the Latino GOP vote. And I wonder if you could just give us some of the main points of it, and then I'll ask you some questions about it. But because you did some research, you really crunched some numbers, and that I think is that's what sets you apart.
Yeah, and this is something anyone in my social circle will tell you that I've been ranting about this for years. I used to work for Tucker Carlson's show at Fox, and a lot of times we'd get pitched these stories about, a Hispanic Republican running maybe in a district in Texas, and we'd have the candidate on, and they'd always say something like, oh, the Republicans are going to win the Hispanic vote. We just need to talk about these certain issues. And I would always caution my colleagues of saying, look, that's not true. Republicans aren't going to win. This was ahead of the 2022 midterms. And I've seen it for several cycles now. I heard it in 2020. There was this idea that Trump was going to do really well with black voters like no Republican had before, that he was going to do really well with Hispanics or even win Hispanics. Saw it again in 2022. And I hear that chatter again. And if you just look historically, not even in just those last two elections, but really every election in the modern era, Democrats have never lost the Hispanic vote. Sure, you can go back at 2020 and say, look, Trump improved by a couple points from 2016, but especially when we got to the 2022 midterms, we were promised this red wave that was going to be in part because of Hispanic voters, and Joe Biden won the Hispanic vote in every single state, with the exception of Florida. Florida's a little bit of an anomaly. I talk about that in my piece, and we can get into the intricacies of that. But part of what pushed me to write this was, look, we're ahead of another election, and this chatter is continuing again. There have been a couple polls showing Trump actually beating Biden by 6 points among Hispanics. That was the latest New York Times poll in March. And so what I don't want Republicans to do is to look at these polls and to convince themselves that that's going to happen. I mean, we've done that before. And I think what we're at risk of doing, which happened to Trump in 2020, was President Trump thought by winning these minority voters or by winning them, by gaining them a few points that he had in 2016, it could kind of offset his losing support among suburban white women or some white rural voters. And that turned out not to be the case. Trump lost traditionally suburban Republican districts. He lost white working class and white rural voters. They dropped by about 2 to 3 points from what his support was in 2016. And as I explained in the piece, it's simple math. So look, on paper, it sounds great that you do better by 6 or 7 points with Hispanics. And, someone may say, well, 6 or 7 with Hispanics can offset, -2 points with white working class. But in a lot of these states, the white working class vote is greater just by numbers than Hispanics are. I mean, you look at Arizona, you look at Georgia, you look at Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the Hispanic vote isn't as important there as some of these other demographics. And even then, even the Hispanic communities that do exist in those areas, they're not going to vote for Trump. And so even if he improves by a couple of points, it's not going to determine the outcome of the election. So that was the focus of my piece. And I hope, people will take away from it is, look, it's great to get new voters into the party where you can. But resources are finite, and you shouldn't compromise on principle. You shouldn't compromise on resources where they're much better needed. And I think there's some areas that the Trump campaign is going to have to look at and really pick their spots here in terms of strategy and outreach.
Well, that was going to be my next question. That's where the rubber hits the road. I mean, I wanted to ask you, was the reason why you wrote this just to be a truth teller, which I love doing, even if there's nothing to do after you know that truth, just to be a little bit more aware of realities? There's a value in that alone. But are you advising the Republican Party, like, hey, if you're thinking about pandering, if you're thinking about maybe changing a policy or two, just so that you can make the inroads here, don't, because it's not worth it. It's not going to happen. Just push a principle that's good for all of America. I mean, is that really the message you want to get across?
Well, it's both. Let me give you an example in my hometown of Miami, Florida, where we have been known for several election cycles, obviously, for the Cuban American vote. They have traditionally been viewed as a very conservative voting bloc. And actually, before Trump came around, they were tilting more towards the Democratic Party. I mean, Obama did much better with them than Democrats had in years past. And so Trump and DeSantis were really able to turn that around. I mean, they dominated with Cuban voters down here in South Florida, and it helped them really make Florida a solid red state. I think there's a mistake that Republicans make is they say, okay, what messages did we use to win over Cuban Americans? Okay, we talk about socialism. Let's advertise and market to these voters about how the Democratic Party is embracing socialism because they came from socialist Cuba. Many Cuban Americans here fled Castro's regime. That message will appeal to them and they will feel motivated to come out and vote for us. Great, that message works for Cuban Americans. The problem is Cuban Americans aren't really, a large community in any other state in the country. I mean, you look at Texas, Arizona, Nevada. These are some states that Trump would have to win that have sizable Hispanic communities. And the Cuban American population doesn't really exist there. And so I think what the Republican Party has done in the past is they take pockets of the Hispanic community where the message has worked. in this case, South Florida and the socialist message, and they try to nationalize that. And that's just not going to appeal to Hispanics at a national level. I think what the Republican Party should do is, yes, like you said, don't pander. It's not going to work, but maybe look at areas across the country. For example, the Rio Grande Valley is a good example. Look, there's a lot of Mexican Americans there. Mexican Americans have typically voted for Democrats in upwards of 65% in every single election cycle. But Republicans have made some inroads with a couple of Mexican communities along the Rio Grande Valley because of what's happening with immigration. And so there has been a movement to the right there. So I know it's complicated and it's really, you have to understand these communities across the country. But my message would be, yes, don't pander. Look at different communities in different states and see how they differ. Look at the polling. I mean, look at what issues are important to them. That's another area I talk about in my piece where, again, there's this very, very outdated view about Hispanics that, oh, they're conservative on the issue of abortion. They're going to be natural Republican voters. And that's actually not true, for example. I mean, I think in a lot of these states, for example, just last month, there was a poll out of Arizona that said 75% of Arizona Hispanics wanted to vote for a candidate who was going to expand abortion access. That's pretty in line with what we saw after the 2022 midterms. CNN exit polls showed that 75% of Hispanics, 60% even in Texas, even 60% of the conservative Cuban voters here in my state support abortion. So you have to look at these issues. You kind of have to look at issue by issue. And so I think Republicans are stuck in the past when it comes to the Hispanic vote. They're sort of 20 years behind, thinking that they lean a certain way when the reality is that they don't.
Yeah, another point that you made in your column was the sheer enormity of the numbers here and the difficulty of actually defining what a Latino or Hispanic voter is. Now, you touched on that a little bit with the Cuban vote and how they differ from other types of Latinos. I mean, it's not a homogenous group at all, just to say Latino, just like same thing with Asian voters. It's so different depending on where you are. But one of the things that I've become an expert on, because it's also my own community, and there's been similar arguments made, is the Jewish vote. Now, I always say when you talk about the Jewish vote, it's like Fight Club. The first rule of the Jewish vote is there's no such thing as a Jewish vote. There's just such a tiny, tiny number. It really doesn't affect anything except for some local elections. However, the one potential exception is Pennsylvania. Because Pennsylvania is a swing state, it's not just because it's a swing state, it's because it's a swing state where the suburbs of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia swing the state every single time. And those just happen to be the places where there's a large Jewish community. The Jewish vote in Pennsylvania could potentially, it's not definite, could potentially swing the election. And that's where it's worth talking about. So I think you've already talked about it. If you're going to talk about the Latino vote, first of all, another thing I always say, the national election is also like Fight Club. There is no such thing. Right. As a national election. We don't have national elections in this country. But I think, so if you could narrow, you mentioned a little bit, but just, time for just one more answer. What would be the one state, because I told everyone, in the Jewish vote, just talk about it with Pennsylvania. Everything else, leave away. Is there one state, obviously preferably a swing state, where you think this actually makes sense to focus on?
I would say Georgia and Arizona. There are more than 500,000 Hispanics in Georgia. I think far more than I expected when I did the research. And there's obviously a large number in Arizona as well. And so when you look at those two states, Georgia and Arizona, that Trump has to win, he's got to look at the issues that matter to those voters in those states. I wouldn't say he's doing very well in Arizona. Biden actually increased the Democratic Party's lead among Hispanics from Hillary's performance by 3 to 4 points. So not only now are you working behind what you initially did in 2016, you got to make up that 3 to 4% and then some. So he's in a tough spot, I think, in that state. Can he offset it in Nevada? Maybe, but certainly Georgia and Arizona. And I don't know that the answer to win those states is the Hispanic vote. It could be, but again, I go back to my analogy about, would you rather have 6 to 7% of a small group or 2% of a very large group? So even if he improves by a large number in those two swing states, I'm not sure it closes the gap on the types of vote he needs. Really quickly too on just describing who Hispanics are. I should have started with that at the top, but that's a huge misconception too. I think a lot of people look at Hispanics and Latinos and think it's an ethnicity, but it's really not. I mean, you have, as I explained in the piece, you have Hispanics who descend from Europe. I mean, you have from Spain, from Germany, from Italy, European Hispanics. You have Hispanics who are descended from the African slave trade, so you have Black Hispanics. You have Hispanics who descend from the indigenous populations in Latin America. So you have Hispanics of all different colors. You have Hispanics from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, different nationalities that vote differently. And so I think it's a mistake if any political party. I think the Democrats have benefited for a long time from just winning the Hispanic vote in general. And so I think that allows them to say Hispanics. I think Republicans are wrong to play into that game. I think if you want to look at different nationalities, Cubans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and again, look at Florida. Florida, just because you can't nationalize Florida's strategy doesn't mean that, you can't use some of that elsewhere. The Puerto Rican vote's a good example. Puerto Ricans were solid Democratic voters in our state for a very long time, but Marco Rubio and Ron DeSantis won upwards of 55-56% of Puerto Rican voters in the midterms, which shocked me. I mean, that's unheard of. And so if Republicans can take the economic messaging that I think work with that community, or even looked at how they did outreach, I mean, maybe you have to tweak it a little bit if you're in another state, but again, just stay away from the national messaging. It's not going to work. And then at the end of the day, too, like you say about Pennsylvania, it doesn't make sense in the state. Otherwise, you're wasting your time.
Yeah. Well, and also everyone, I hope everyone noticed that Eduardo said Nevada. Okay, that's how you say the name of that state. If you learn nothing else from this entire segment, but all joking aside, this is the kind of stuff you hear on The Analyst. There is absolutely no other media outlet that will describe the Latino or Hispanic vote than the way that we just did. This is unique stuff. You're getting it dispassionately. Nobody here is cheering or crying. We're trying to be very honest and give people an analysis that you will not hear anywhere else. Eduardo, just in 10 seconds, tell us where people can find not only that column, but all your stuff.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at EDU, and then my last name, Neret, EDU Neret, and I'm on Substack, so I just started writing. You can find that latest piece there, and then some of my video work. It's Neret Files, Neret Files.com.
Right, and sometimes he fills in for some very big people online, on web shows and stuff like that too.
I'm doing it again next week, Jake, so we got to have you back.
Fantastic. My strong thanks to Eduardo Neret, and of course we had Mary Walter earlier in the program. So glad that we were able to get, again, this analysis, especially Eduardo's analysis of the Latino vote, is something that you only hear on The Analyst. That was graduate school level type of analysis. We are not pretending to be unbiased. Everyone has biases. There's no such thing. But we are giving you graduate school level analysis. The only time that you see that kind of level of analysis of anything on TV is when you watch the NFL Sunday shows, especially when it comes to political analysis on TV. Even on PBS, it's third grade level cheering sections. It's not real analysis, and that's what we give you here. So we hope that you appreciate it, no matter what side of the political fence you're on. We give it to you straight. And if you think that we're all right wing all the time, I think if you watch this episode, you know that we have plenty of criticisms of the right and the left. I'm Jake Novak. Thanks for joining us on The Analyst. More unique content like this is coming to you really, really soon. You'll see it then. Thank you so much.